Or
Yeah, that'd be
okay,
great. Yep, it's
okay,
yeah,
all
it's
right, cool.
12 o'clock. So yep, I was writing down things. Yeah. So thank you. And I hope you're spotlighted for everybody. You're spotlighted for me. I'm just gonna mute and stay out of your way, okay?
All right, we got a short session today. Hello, everyone. I am Katie Fielding. I am a tech coach from right outside Washington, D.C. in Virginia. I'm a Google innovator, trainer, and coach. I'm a Canvas certified educator. I'm an Adobe creative crew, other ed tech stuff. I'm just a big nerd. But I'm excited that you're here today to talk about accessibility. And I'm going to give you some tips and guidelines that you should follow when creating your classroom content. You know, I've been in education 17 years. And when I started creating content, that was creating worksheets that I would print out. And I did a lot of things, a lot of practices that when I take that work and put it into a digital space, it just doesn't work. It's just not accessible for different users. And I'm going to be talking about those different users today. I'm going to put a link again in the chat to my resources. So I'll be referring to a Wakelet, which is in that resources. And then there's going to be a lot of videos at the bottom of that webpage. And all those videos are how-to videos about a lot of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about today. So this is a quick session, but you do have those resources to go back to later and use as needed. And I do see that we are in Zoom and it does have live transcription. So at the bottom of your screen, you should see the little CC. And if you need those captions, please turn those on because accessibility is important. I just also want to remind you that you today are an expert learner and you should practice those universal design of learning expert learner qualities, which are self-regulation. So get comfortable, sit and be in a space that is conducive to your learning, perceive what's helpful to you. So if it helps you to look at my slides or my resources while I'm talking and not look at me, that's completely fine. For those of you who may be low vision or blind, all of the decorative elements on the slides are completely decorative and have no bearing on the understanding or have any additional value to the presentation besides decorative. So you're not losing anything if you cannot view those slides. And lastly, I invite you to go away from this session and take some action and bring these practices into your classroom. Because that's what expert learners do, is they take action on what they've learned. If you're not familiar with UDL or Universal Design for Learning, which I just referred to, it is a framework that accounts for the variability in all learners. And the middle section is all about representation and providing multiple means of representation. So maybe that means text and video or audio, multiple ways for students to get their knowledge. When we do that, we also need to make sure that all those multiple ways are accessible. So for providing video, we're giving captions. If we're providing text, maybe we're giving a read aloud resource to support that. So I'll be talking about that, but this really falls into UDL really nicely. And why do we want to make the content accessible? As educators, it's our legal responsibility. It is just a professional activity to do, and it's ethical. As teachers, we want to be ethical and make sure our classrooms are not having any barriers to learning for any student. And so making our content accessible is important. And I may say a few things today that may startle you or rattle you because you're like, oh no, I do that all the time. And that's okay. You're going to learn today, maybe that's a practice you can kind of try and transition out of and learn some new ways to do things. Let me talk about who we're benefiting here. We're going to be benefiting by doing a lot of these things for those students or caregivers who are blind or low vision, people who are colorblind, which is 8% of the population, so pretty big population is colorblind, the deaf and hard of hearing, those who have limited mobility, perhaps maybe a student has cerebral palsy and they can move limited, they have limited mobility, and so they use maybe their voice to control their computer. Those who are neurodiverse, and everyone benefits from accessibility. I come to accessibility as a disabled person myself. I was born with cystic fibrosis, which is a genetic lung disease. And so while I actually have no I don't know what happened, but I'm back. All right, so I've benefited from accessibility features, even if I haven't explicitly needed them. And I'll share some examples of that as I go. All right, later, in addition to the resources that I shared, I recommend these 3 resources on how to make things accessible: the Accessible Education Materials website, which is part of cas.org. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0, those are the international web development guidelines. So if you think of a web developer, a coder, they use these guidelines to make sure their web tools that they're building are accessible. And then Web AIM, which is a great site that takes those international standards and put them in really understandable ways to implement them for someone like you or me, and also gives really great examples. Progress. Also, before I go any further, I'd like to kind of explain what a screen reader is. A screen reader, because I'll be referring to it several times. A screen reader is a tool that someone who has limited mobility, is low vision, or blind may have installed on their computer. It is an application, and it helps that person navigate their computer so they can speak to their computer, and and the computer will speak to them and open programs, close programs, do everything that we do on a computer by clicking buttons and cite. That is what the screen reader does. I say that because many of us as educators are familiar with something like Immersive Reader, which would read aloud the page to a student. But that is actually just a reading enhancement tool, not a screen reader, which is actually for the whole navigation and utilization of a computer. So I just wanted to share that terminology because I will be referring to it several times as I go. All right, so let's get into accessibility and what we can do as educators to break down barriers for students in our classroom. There are 4 categories to accessibility, and we have a nice little acronym right here, POUR, P-O-U-R, the perceivable, the operable, the understandable, and the robust. Those are the 4 areas of accessibility that we have some control over. Let's first dive into the perceivable. This is what is perceived with eyes, ears, and touch. The first thing that I want to talk about is alt text. So in most programs, you could right click on an image and you can add some alt text. You may have seen some boxes for that before. In this box, you should write some context and function text that allows someone who is using a screen reader, who is blind, who cannot see that image, to understand why that image is on the page and what it's doing there and what it's about. So I have a little quiz for you if you want to do it. I'm going to put the link to it in the chat. It's a little Nearpod quiz, and it has some images, and it will give you some options for what some alt text might be for those images. And so go ahead if you like while I'm talking and continuing to talk and answer those questions. If you don't want to, no worries. All right, so alt text is the first thing you can do in the perceivable zone to help make your materials more accessible. The next thing you can do, whenever you paste a link on a page, never just copy and paste the link directly onto the paper. You always want to hide it within some text. And you never want that text to be click here or read more. You want that text to actually tell the person, specifically a person using a screen reader or those who are neurodiverse, all these little clues help those people, tells them where they're going. So when I click this link, I know, for instance, in the slide next to me, instead of putting that URL, if I click that link that says Canvas, I'm going to go to Canvas.
Yeah.
Did you get a little feedback?
I knew it was Lincoln because that corner was wet and that.
All right. Sounds like someone had their mic on. All right. The next thing, we always want to make sure when we embed materials, for instance, my district uses Canvas, and we love being able to embed things onto the Canvas page. But for those using a screen reader, that is not navigable with their screen reader. So it's very important to also put a direct link to any materials at the top of the page of any embedded material or just above the embedded material. This is a great example of where accessibility benefits everyone, because when you embed material, it's really great, but those on mobile devices have problems with embedded materials. So by putting that link at the top above the embedded material, you're going to benefit anyone using a mobile device, whether they have an accessibility need or not. All right, the next one is captions and transcriptions. I often ask after this presentation, if I can only do one thing, which one should I do? This and alt text would be it. Captions and transcriptions. You need to make sure that your videos have accurate captions. And if you give podcasts to listen to, that you have accurate transcriptions to go along with them. If you use tools like YouTube, Flipgrid Shorts, Canvas Studio, all of those tools can auto-generate captions, which is awesome. But you do need to go back and check for their accuracy. They are not going to be 100% accurate, and that can be just as hard as having no captions at all. So make sure that your captions, after they're auto-generated, are accurate. And there is some videos in my resources showing you how to do that. Next is logical order. This is really going to help those students who are neurodiverse make sense of what's on your page. If you're making sure that everything you're putting on the page is in logical order, well organized, has good grammar and good spelling. That good grammar and spelling is also going to help those students using screen readers, because it's going to make sense. And of course, it's going to help everyone. If things are misspelled, it's going to be harder for everyone. So this is actually, something you have to do by hand checking. This isn't something any, accessibility checker can check for. So this is just another thing on the list to make sure you're doing. And this is where the teachers start to come for me. Like I am Beast in Belle's Castle. Creating accessible tables. Tables are only for data and should not be used for formatting. I know that when I made worksheets back in 2004, 2005, I would put a table and I would use that to help lay out my worksheet on a page. That is a big no-no when it comes to digital documents. Tables should only be ever used to share and display data. And you also need to, when doing that, create correct header rows or header columns. So I have some videos that will show you how to do that, but I know I'm in a Canvas district, so I have a lot of teachers who like to make a table to lay out buttons on their front page. And that's just a big no-no accessibility wise. So bulleted lists or list are far superior to using a formatted table to lay things out. All right. The use of color. Now, I said earlier that 8% of the population is colorblind, so this is a big one. Color should never be an indicator of directions or importance. So you should never say, do the things in green or do the things in red. There may be people that cannot see those colors. Also, you should use a color contrast checker when creating graphics. So if you are creating graphics for, say, your school's Facebook or other social media platforms, you want to make sure that the text and the background color is a good contrast. For instance, I am doing this presentation with a white background and dark blue text primarily, and that passes a color contrast checker. You can imagine that this presentation would be harder to read if I had a red background and pink text. So you want to make sure that the difference, the contrast between the two colors of text and background is strong. And there are color contrast checkers you can use. You can enter the hex code of the text and the hex code, the 6-digit code for the color of the background. And you can see if the color ratio is strong enough. It will give you a pass or it will give you a fail. All right. And the last part of the perceivable zone, so we're almost done with the P, is readable fonts. We want to make sure we're choosing readable fonts. We can love those decorative, fun, scripty fonts, but those can be hard to read, and they're especially hard to read when used a lot of or in very small size. I recommend using those sparingly and as big headers on a page or on a slide. I prefer to go towards what are called sans serif fonts without the little tails at the end of the letters, very clean line fonts. This whole presentation is done with LexEnd, which is a font that I love. And yes, Amy, there is a checklist in that wakelet. That waitlist is a whole checklist that goes over all of these things. Yeah. All right. The next zone is the operable zone. So this is how someone would navigate the computer or the program that you're using. So you want to make sure that it's structured and organized as possible and as few clicks as possible. Of course, we want to chunk our information as teachers, and we may only want certain things on certain pages, but as long as they're not having to click, click, click for every little thing, that's the idea. All right, also be mindful of GIFs. There are people who literally can die by viewing GIFs because it will induce seizures. So you want to be very careful about your use of GIFs and very selective of when you're using them and how quickly they flash. Something to be mindful of. That is literally a life or death decision. All right, using headings. So we're often used to, as teachers, just making the font bigger to create a heading for a paragraph or a section of work. But what we really want to do is use the section headings or the paragraph styles. This will allow someone who's using a screen reader to quickly navigate the page because the screen reader will read to them those headings first, and then kind of like we would do with vision, decide, oh, that's the heading and I want to read more. They can decide, I just want to read that particular section. If everything is classified as a paragraph, the screen reader will have to read them the whole page. And even though they may be listening at 600 words per minute, which is quite a lot if you think about how fast you can read or type, 600 words per minute is especially fast. Even if they can do it that fast, you're still wasting their time. So there's a video about how to use headings in Word, in Google Docs, and on a web page, and definitely use those. Yes, headings are also generated a great table of contents in Google Docs. That is a great addition, Angela, 100% yes. All right, understandable. This is the third category. So we want to make sure that everything on the page is understandable. And the first thing in this part is to use plain language. And I love the Hemingway editor. It is a web page where you can go copy and paste your text, and it will tell you the reading level. If there are any complicated sentences, run-on sentences, word choice that could be better. So definitely that is a tool to check out. Also, consistent navigation. If you use a tool like Canvas, or if you guys have class web pages or something, you always want the navigation to be the same predictability. You want those links on the left side of a Canvas course, for instance, to always be in the same order, whether the student is in Spanish or English or art. So our school has a set order that teachers put this in. This is not just helpful for students using screen readers. We have found this is extremely helpful for our newcomer L students because they can start to identify those words and they know the order and they know quickly how to get where they want to go. So very good. Create those consistent practices for students to do online. Provide clear instructions. So we want to make sure that all the instructions that we give are clear. So, maybe have one student read them and give you some feedback. But another way, the great part about digital instructions, like in your LMS, is you can revise them at any time. You don't have to print a whole new set of worksheets off to revise directions. So just be flexible in revising your directions. And the last category that I'm going to mention is the robust. And this is completely in the hands of the person developing the tool. So like the person who created Google Classroom or the person who created a Canvas LMS. These are those web developers. So we have no control over this. If you are in charge of IT, it is important that you keep this in mind and ask that company about their accessibility and what they're doing to make sure all the stuff they do is accessible. All right, and I mentioned before accessibility checkers. There are many tools that have these built in, but there are things that they cannot check for. So they can't tell if your videos have captions. They can't tell if you've used color as a direction. Those are just some things that you as a human, which are better than computers, will have to check for. And as I mentioned before, you also want to make sure that your documents are accessible. Office 365 tools all have an accessibility checker under the review menu. Google Workspace doesn't have one built in, but there is an add-on called Grackle Docs, which will allow you to do and tell you all the steps you need to do to fix your accessibility for that document. And if you are a PDF user, you can do a lot of accessibility in Adobe Acrobat. However, I will say PDFs are super hard to make accessible. I've done a 10-hour class and I still can't do it correctly. So if at all possible, take that information from the PDF and paste it directly on the page that you're providing, like the school's web page or your class page. Just avoid PDFs if at all possible. All right. So that is all I really have. There is a little wrap up Nearpod quiz. So if you're still in that Nearpod, you can go back and answer a few questions. But I would love if anyone has any questions right now to just feel free to ask, or anything you'd like to share. We have about 5 minutes left. Anyone, any questions? You feel free to put them in the chat, or feel free to come off the mic and ask.
So you said the checklist is the Wakelet, right?
Yes. Mhm.
Okay, where is that? I'm looking on the website and the link.
It's embedded on the page, so you should see a blue tab that says view the Wakelet. I'll put the link in the chat again.
Okay.
You Wakelet a new tab, and you should be able to open that, and you'll see
Thank
that it's
you.
a, yep, no, no
Thank you.
problem. Yeah.
I just had one thought to share.
Yeah, please.
Districts that are working on computer science curriculum, you know, because of the new legislation that's coming along, and they're studying the standards for impacts of computing. There are a ton, from the things that you've shared, ton of lesson ideas for students to take a digital project, poster, whatever, and then examine it for accessibility and add to and change. And so it's really exciting to hear your ideas and to think about it through the lens of lessons and units that we'll already be wanting to pursue in the next year or two.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, usually this is a short one, 25 minutes. When I do this longer, I do talk about doing that with students and having them start to do accessibility in their own work and bringing that into your classroom. So it's definitely a practice that we can have students start doing too. Making sure when they make a video to caption it, making sure when they make a document to do the accessibility checker, because they're going to be out in the world making things for businesses, and accessibility is a huge future skill. Angela says, I like to use emojis for organization on the Canvas pages, for example, the Target. How does this check out for accessibility? Yeah, it is accessible because the screen reader will read them emoji, but what you need to do and make sure is use one of those, you said you're in Canvas, perfect. Use a text header and make a little key at the top of your module of what each emoji represents. That way they'll be read those emojis and what they're representing, and they will also understand what those are for. Does that help you out, Angela?
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah. And Deb says, oh my God, I love the idea of students creating accessible products. It helps with empathy and unmet anything. Yes, exactly. Yeah, I'm glad you like that, Deb. Anything else? Well, I do also put out a newsletter. So if you'd like to subscribe to that, I will put the link in the chat. You are welcome, Katie. So you do have a student this year. And I love that you said that, because I do want everyone to know, like, yes, Katie's going to have a student that she knows is in her class, but there are going to be a lot of students who are not going to disclose their disabilities. And there are going to be a lot of parents that we don't get IEPs for. So it's really important for us to remember these things with all of our users in mind. And we don't know what the parents at home who we've seen after this year are really helping their kids learn at home, what accessibility features they're going to need. So we do it once and do it at the beginning. It's a lot easier to build in the accessibility as we go than to go back and fix it later. So I am glad this was helpful to you. And it was so nice to meet you all today. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Katie. I mean, my mind is just exploding right now. So I'm going to have to go back and go through that. And it's so great to remember to be mindful of that. It's really amazing. Just wanted to invite
a high cognitive load session.
It was, and rapid fire, and plus, yeah, I was having to manage some of the stuff. So thank you for sharing those resources. I definitely, as Amy reminded me at the last session, make a note to go back over it. Otherwise I'll forget to go back, you know, as summer hits in. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yes, yeah, I always usually in my hour session like to have the last 5 minutes actually for a reflection, which I actually have like right here, but we don't have time for that. But if you want to do your own reflection, I recommend it. 3 facts you learned, 2 ahas, and a big question for you to think about later. This is a great reflection prompt you can use with your students too.
Right, yeah, great. Wow, Katie, I'm so glad you're part of our conference. This has been wonderful.
Thanks for
So just
having
want
me.
to